China did not replace Iran's American GPS overnight. It transitioned Iran's military navigation architecture over time to a different satellite system. And that distinction is where the entire report begins. That is the claim in the title. It suggests a sudden switch, a single decision, a clean technological replacement. That is not how this happened. What happened was a gradual, systematic shift in dependency from the American Global Positioning System to China's BeiDou 3 satellite constellation, executed before the conflict reached its current phase. By the end of this, you will have the answer to what that actually means. Before I go further, I want to know where you are watching this from and how this shift is being explained in your country's media. Put it in the comments, and stay until the end because the structural implication of this transition is not what most people think it is. Let me be precise about this. Here is what happened. Over a period of months and years prior to the war, China expanded the integration of its BeiDou 3 navigation system into Iranian military infrastructure. This included missile guidance systems, drone navigation, and broader battlefield coordination tools. This was not limited to positioning signals. It extended into mapping, signals intelligence support, and geospatial targeting data. Here is what the data actually shows. Iranian weapons systems that previously relied, at least in part, on signals from the American GPS constellation were transitioned to rely on BeiDou 3. This matters because GPS is a system the United States has spent decades learning how to disrupt. Jamming, spoofing, signal degradation, these are not theoretical capabilities. They are embedded into American electronic warfare doctrine. BeiDou 3 is not GPS. It operates on different frequencies. It uses encrypted signals designed specifically to resist external interference. It is a separate architecture, built with the explicit understanding that foreign militaries would attempt to disrupt it. And this is where the analysis has to be very careful, because the next part is where most people draw the wrong conclusion. The report is not simply that China gave Iran better navigation. The report is that China removed a known vulnerability from Iran's military systems, a vulnerability that the United States had built its operational expectations around. Today's battlefield advantage is often yesterday's dependency, quietly removed. Think carefully about what that means. For decades, American military planners operated under an assumption that adversary systems dependent on GPS could be degraded or neutralized through electronic warfare. That assumption shaped doctrine, investment, and operational planning. Now consider the structural shift. If Iranian missiles and drones are no longer dependent on GPS, then the effectiveness of those American countermeasures is reduced, not eliminated, reduced, because the system they were designed to disrupt is no longer the system being used. This is not what most people think it is. This is not about a single missile becoming more accurate. It is about an entire class of countermeasures becoming less effective against a specific adversary. And this is the part of the report that almost no one in Western media is explaining accurately. The transition to BeiDou 3 was not an isolated technological upgrade. It was part of a broader set of capabilities provided by China. According to the summary data, this includes satellite imagery, terrain mapping, signals intelligence support, and geospatial targeting data. Taken together, this forms what military planners call a kill chain: detection, identification, targeting, guidance, impact. Each step can be accelerated or degraded depending on the quality of data and the resilience of systems. What China provided was not just the navigation signal. It was a set of tools that reshaped how quickly and how reliably that kill chain could operate. Speed in warfare is rarely about movement. It is about decision time. Now consider the implication described in the summary. The shift to BeiDou did not just improve accuracy. It reduced the effectiveness of American electronic warfare tools designed for GPS disruption. That means Iranian systems guided by BeiDou are harder to jam, harder to spoof, and harder to deflect. This does not mean they are invulnerable. It means the existing American toolkit is less effective against them. That is a very different statement. Let me be very precise about this. Every Iranian missile that successfully struck an American or allied military installation while using BeiDou-guided navigation did so within a different technological environment than what American planners had historically prepared for. Not a completely new environment, but a modified one. And modifications at this level matter. Technology does not change outcomes instantly. It changes probabilities over time. Now place this within a broader timeline. This transition did not occur during the war. It occurred before the war reached its current intensity. That means this was not a reactive measure. It was pre-war preparation. This is a critical point, because it tells us something about intent, not in the sense of aggression or defense, but in the sense of anticipation. To understand why this matters, you have to understand how military systems are built. They are not designed in weeks. They are structured over years. Integration of satellite navigation into missile systems requires testing, calibration, training, and doctrinal adjustment, which means this shift was not improvised. It was planned. Preparation is visible only after the system is used, and this leads to the central analytical question of this report. If China systematically helped transition Iran's military navigation and targeting infrastructure away from a system the United States knows how to disrupt and toward one it does not control, then what exactly was the strategic logic behind that decision? Because this is not just a technical change, it is a structural one. Miscalculation requires no malice, only two different definitions of acceptable risk. That question, about strategic logic, is where we turn next. The transition from GPS to BeiDou 3 was not a technological favor. It was a strategic calculation made by multiple actors operating within their own internal logic. Let me be precise about this. To understand why China supported this shift, you have to begin with how Beijing defines vulnerability. In Chinese strategic thinking, dependence on a foreign-controlled system, especially one controlled by a potential adversary, is not a neutral condition. It is a structural risk. GPS is owned, operated, and controlled by the United States. That means, in a crisis, access can be degraded, denied, or manipulated. Not hypothetically, technically and operationally. From Beijing's perspective, any country relying on GPS for military operations is, by definition, exposed to American leverage. This is not what most people think it is. The decision to promote BeiDou internationally is not only about economic influence or technological prestige. It is about building an alternative infrastructure layer, one that reduces dependency on American-controlled systems. Control over infrastructure is control over options. Now apply that logic to Iran. Iran for decades has operated under conditions where American military pressure is not theoretical, it is constant. Sanctions, surveillance, and the presence of American military assets in the region create an environment where vulnerability is continuously assessed. If Iranian missile systems rely on GPS, then those systems carry a built-in weakness, one that American electronic warfare units are specifically trained to exploit. So the Iranian calculation is straightforward: reduce that vulnerability. And this is where the analysis must remain disciplined. Iran did not switch to BeiDou because it is better in an abstract sense. It switched because it is outside American control. That is the key distinction. Technology choice is rarely about performance alone. It is about who controls failure. Now consider Beijing's position. China publicly positions itself as a neutral actor, often emphasizing diplomacy and stability. At the same time, it has, according to the summary, provided Iran with a range of capabilities: satellite navigation, geospatial intelligence, terrain mapping, and signals intelligence support. Washington reads this as strategic alignment against American interests. Beijing reads this as expanding technological ecosystems and partnerships, particularly in regions where American dominance has historically limited alternatives. Both readings follow internal logic. Both sides are correct about what they see. Neither is correct about what the other sees. And this is where the structural layer becomes visible. China has spent years developing BeiDou 3, not only as a domestic system, but as a global alternative. This includes encrypted military-grade signals designed specifically to resist interference. The design itself reflects an expectation that in any future conflict environment, satellite navigation systems will be contested. Which brings us to a critical data point in this report. BeiDou 3 uses different signal frequencies and encryption protocols than GPS. This is not a minor technical detail. It means that the tools developed over decades by the United States to jam or spoof GPS signals are not directly transferable to BeiDou. And this is the part of the report that almost no one is explaining accurately. Electronic warfare is not universal. It is system-specific. The ability to disrupt one satellite navigation system does not automatically grant the ability to disrupt another. Capability is always narrower than it appears in doctrine. Now think carefully about what that means. If American forces encounter Iranian systems guided by BeiDou, they are operating against a signal architecture that their existing countermeasures were not primarily designed for. Again, this does not mean those systems cannot be countered. It means the margin of effectiveness changes. And margins matter in warfare. Let me be very precise about this. The summary states that Chinese support extended beyond navigation. It included satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and geospatial targeting data. It also references Chinese firms, Mizar Vision and Jing'an Technology, marketing geospatial intelligence products focused on American forces in the region. This is not a random detail. It suggests that the support was not limited to hardware or signals. It included data layers that improved targeting accuracy and reduced decision time. And this is where the concept of the kill chain becomes essential again. Detection, identification, targeting, engagement. If each step becomes faster and more reliable, the overall system becomes more effective, even if no single component is dramatically superior. Systems win wars. Components only matter within systems. Now consider the American perspective. The United States has built its military dominance in part on the assumption of technological superiority, including control over key infrastructures like GPS. When an adversary shifts to an alternative system, that assumption is challenged, not eliminated, but complicated. Washington reads this as a deliberate attempt to undermine its operational advantages, which, from its perspective, it is. But from Beijing's perspective, this is consistent with a broader pattern, reducing reliance on American-controlled systems across multiple domains: trade, technology, finance, and now, navigation. This was not a surprise. The trajectory was visible. This was not inevitable. It became likely through a series of specific decisions. Now bring Iran back into the picture. Iran is not a passive recipient in this process. It is an active participant making its own strategic calculations. Faced with a technologically superior adversary, the rational response is to identify asymmetries. Electronic warfare is one such asymmetry. If the United States can disrupt GPS-dependent systems, then shifting away from GPS is a logical counter. This is not ideological, it is operational. And this leads to the most clarifying point in this report. Every Iranian missile or drone guided by BeiDou is operating within a different vulnerability structure than one guided by GPS. Not immune, but differently exposed. Changing the system changes the map of risk. Think about what that means at scale. This is not one missile. It is an entire class of systems operating under a revised set of assumptions. And this is where both sides are, in a sense, reinforcing each other's behavior. The United States invests in capabilities to dominate GPS-based environments. China builds alternatives to GPS. Iran adopts those alternatives to reduce exposure to American capabilities. Each step is internally rational. Together, they produce a structural shift. And this brings us to the final question. If each actor is behaving rationally within its own framework, reducing vulnerability, expanding capability, responding to perceived threats, then what does the overall structure of this interaction produce over time? Because that outcome is not determined by intent alone. It is determined by the interaction of systems. Structural forces do not require bad intentions to produce bad outcomes. That is the conclusion we now turn to. What this case demonstrates is not simply a technological shift, but the emergence of parallel military infrastructures that no longer operate within the same assumptions. Let me be precise about this. For decades, the United States built a system of military dominance that relied not only on weapons, but on control over the underlying architecture: navigation, communications, surveillance. GPS was part of that architecture. It was both a tool and a point of leverage. What we are now observing is the gradual erosion of that singular architecture, not through confrontation alone, but through substitution. Power declines first in the systems no longer used. Think carefully about what that means. China did not need to disable GPS globally. It only needed to provide an alternative that specific partners could adopt. Once that alternative is integrated, the relevance of GPS, as a point of control, decreases in that specific context. This is not a collapse, it is a fragmentation. And this is where the analysis must move beyond the immediate battlefield. The transition to BeiDou in Iranian systems is one example of a broader pattern: the creation of parallel technological ecosystems. Systems that operate alongside but not within American-controlled networks. Navigation is one layer. The summary makes clear there are others: satellite imagery, signals intelligence, terrain mapping, geospatial targeting data. Each of these reduces reliance on external infrastructure. When combined, they form a self-reinforcing system. Independence in one layer is vulnerability in another. Systems aim to close that gap. Now consider the structural implication for the battlefield described. If Iranian missiles guided by BeiDou are harder for American electronic warfare systems to disrupt, then the effectiveness of those countermeasures is reduced in that specific interaction. Again, not eliminated, reduced. That reduction changes outcomes at the margin. And margins accumulate. Small changes in probability produce large changes in outcome over time. This is where the narrative often becomes distorted. The claim is framed as US jamming no longer works. That is not a precise statement. What the evidence supports is narrower and more important. Systems designed for GPS disruption are less effective against BeiDou-guided systems. Precision matters here, because exaggeration obscures the real structural change. Let me be very precise about this. The summary states that Chinese support contributed directly to the effectiveness of Iranian strikes, including those that resulted in American casualties. That is a serious claim, and it reflects the operational consequence of the system-level changes we have been discussing. But the mechanism is not singular, it is cumulative. Navigation, targeting data, surveillance, signal resilience, each contributes incrementally. Together, they reshape the kill chain. Outcomes are rarely decided by one advantage, they are decided by accumulated ones. Now step back. This is not the first time we have seen this pattern. During the Cold War, competing blocs built separate technological and military systems to reduce vulnerability to each other. The logic was the same: minimize dependence, maximize control over critical infrastructure. This is not new. What is different is the domain. Digital infrastructure, satellite systems, and data networks now play the role that industrial capacity and supply chains once did. History does not repeat, the structural conditions do. And this is where the global dimension becomes unavoidable. Other countries are watching this, not only major powers, but states across the global south. They are observing a simple reality. Reliance on a single external system creates vulnerability. Alternatives, even if imperfect, create options. This does not mean they will all adopt BeiDou. It means the logic of diversification becomes more compelling. Every system used by one actor becomes a case study for another. Now return to the central relationship. The United States and China are not simply competing in weapons. They are competing in systems, in who defines the infrastructure that others rely on. GPS versus BeiDou is one example. There are others in finance, telecommunications, and digital platforms. Each instance follows a similar pattern. One side builds, the other builds an alternative. Adoption becomes a strategic decision, and over time, the global system becomes less unified. This is a structural shift. This is a structural problem, not a personality problem. Now consider the risk embedded in this structure. When systems diverge, mutual understanding decreases. Tools designed for one environment do not function the same way in another. Assumptions built over decades become less reliable. That increases the possibility of miscalculation, not because actors intend it, but because their models of the environment no longer match reality. Miscalculation begins where assumptions outlive systems. And this brings us to the final analytical line. China's transition of Iranian systems from GPS to BeiDou did not make American electronic warfare obsolete. It exposed its limits within a changing technological environment and signaled that future conflicts will be shaped not by a single dominant system, but by the interaction of multiple competing ones.